Greetings from the Nomadics Tipi makers, and welcome to our teepee setup demonstration. Today, we will be walking you through the process of setting up the 3-pole Native American Indian teepee. Our teepee design follows that which is outlined in the book, The Indian Teepee, Its History, Construction, and Use, by Reginald and Gladys Laubin. Before setting up your teepee, you will, of course, need to choose an acceptable location. Because the teepee is an asymmetrical structure, it is essential that your 3 tripod poles are as level with one another as possible. Be certain also that there is adequate drainage around and away from the teepee area. If you're setting up in an area that gets frequent or drenching rains, you probably will want to put in a base of gravel beneath your teepee. 1 cubic yard of 3/4 inch driveway gravel will spread out perfectly for an 18-foot teepee. Because the prevailing winds in this continent are from the west, the door hole will always face east. If you have strong winds in the area that you live, be mindful that tree limbs might break off and hit your teepee. Set it up accordingly. And if you will be using your teepee in the winter, it's a great idea to set it in an area that will maximize winter sun. Before we begin with our teepee setup instructions, we are going to demonstrate for you the original method that the native people used to determine the proper length for the 3 tripod poles. We will include this as an interesting historical reference only. You will not need to use this method. We will be giving you all the necessary measurements that you will need as we progress through this setup process. In general, there were 2 different structural shapes or geometries for the Plains teepee. Some teepees were perfectly shaped, symmetrical cones. But some teepees were asymmetrical in shape. The back of the teepee was more vertical, or straight up, than the front of the teepee, which was longer in length and had a more sloping angle to it. The reason for this was the strong winds that blew across the Great Basin of the United States. The longer, sloping east side of the teepee framework would serve to brace the teepee against these strong prevailing winds. This asymmetrical shape requires that the poles in the front of the teepee frame be longer than the poles in the back of the teepee frame. This is the style teepee that we make, and it will be the style teepee that we will be setting up for you today. This is frequently referred to as a Sioux style teepee. We will be setting up an 18-foot size teepee that is painted with our personal ceremonial design. To begin the traditional method of laying out the tripod poles for an asymmetrical or Sioux-style teepee, we must first locate the vertex that is used to draw the arc. Then, we need to locate the exact point where the poles will cross on the lift pole flap. Here, I'm going to lay pins exactly as we will be laying the teepee poles themselves. The north and south poles will go straight down the spine of the teepee, and the 2 stakes here will show you the point at the bottom of the lift pole flap, where the door pole will cross the north and south poles in exactly this fashion. This is the layout that we are now going to create by stepping off in the old traditional way to find this exact point for the north, south, and door poles. Notice that they cross right at the base of the lift pole flap. So the next step is we want to tie a line at the end of the smoke flap at the corner where there's a peg loop provided. This line will give us an extended straight line down the smoke flap edge to help us locate the point from which we want to start our measuring around the bottom edge of the teepee cover. Now come back up to the top, measure the distance from the face of the teepee to the point where the rope is tied, and then do the same down beneath the door. I will measure from the fabric again, just beneath the door hole, and line the string up with that distance. Now we have a straight line running down the smoke flap edge. Put a stake at that point because this will be the beginning point for walking around and doing our measuring around the bottom arc of the teepee. What we need to determine now is the proper length of the door pole as it crosses the north and south poles, as you see in the diagram. Now we will begin at the stake, which is approximately at the position A on the diagram you just saw. We will walk toe to heel slowly around the edge of the teepee, counting our steps. So leave a stake in the ground approximately 1/3 of the way around the teepee. You'll use this stake to position exactly where the door pole goes when you finish your step off. Now continue walking toe to heel around the teepee in the old traditional manner. When we get to the very center back of the teepee, directly down the spine, stop and put a stake in. For this 18-foot teepee, I've counted 27 steps. So now we come back to the start, to point A. We walk around the teepee again, toe to heel, to 1/3 of the way. So at 27 steps, we will now go 9 steps. And that will be the exact position for our door pole in laying out the tripod. This stake now is exactly where we will lay the door pole on the edge of the teepee. This will make the door pole the correct length for setting up this asymmetrical teepee. Now we will lay the north pole and the south pole down the spine of the teepee. They will be laid exactly as we showed earlier, with the 2 small sticks. Now we are ready to position the door pole across the north and south poles. We place the butt of the door pole at the position marked by the stake, which we determined earlier in our toe to heel walk-off method. It is very important that the door pole cross the north and south poles at the base of the lift pole flap, as you see here. This concludes our demonstration of the unique and simple traditional method of determining the proper lengths for the tripod poles. This is our Nomadics Tipi Makers 30-page teepee setup booklet that you will receive with your teepee. Use it in coordination with this setup instruction film. Here you see the teepee ropes, lacing pins, and tent stakes that are supplied with your teepee, along with the various tools that you will need to put your teepee up. Starting in the lower left-hand corner, underneath the teepee setup booklet, is a coil of 45-foot long rope, 1/2 inch in diameter. This rope is used to tie your tripod poles together and to secure the rest of the poles for the setup. To the right of the rope, you see your tent stakes. These are used to stake the teepee down. Above the tent stakes are 2 coils of 1/4-inch rope. This rope is used to tie around the poles on the inside of the teepee when hanging your liner. Beneath the rope, and to the right of the tent stakes, is a wood rasp. This wood rasp is used to round and smooth the ends of the poles when you cut them off to make your smoke flap poles. To the right of the wood rasp, in the middle of the picture, are the lacing pins that you will use to lace the front of the teepee together when you bring it around. Above the lacing pins are staples that you will use to put into the poles when you're putting up your liner rope to hang your liner. To the right of the staples are 4 pieces of small wood with nails in them. You will prepare these yourself with the utility knife and secure them behind the liner rope when putting up the liner. The hammer is used to not only put in your stakes around the teepee, but also to put a small nail in the lift pole flap when you're putting up the lift pole. You see the small nail just to the left of the hammer. What you will need there is a 1/2-inch tack or very short nail. To the left of the hammer is also a 25-foot measuring tape. You will need this to do all of your measuring. To the right of the hammer is a utility knife. You will need this to sharpen the ends of your lacing pins so they'll fit through the buttonholes in the front of the teepee. To the right of the hammer is an 1/8 of an inch braided nylon cord. This is very strong cord. It is used to tie from the peg loops to the stakes. It is also used to tie from the end of the smoke flaps to the front of the stake in front of the teepee. Each cord should be cut 30 inches long for each peg loop. In order to determine how many of these you need, count the number of peg loops on your teepee and cut that number of ties for your peg loops. To the right of the rope is a lighter. You can use a lighter or a match or a candle to burn the ends of this nylon cord so they won't ravel. On the far right is a handsaw. Use this to cut the ends of the smoke flap poles to the proper length when you're inserting them into the smoke flap pockets. If you're going to need a rain cap for your teepee, you will also need to saw the ends of the poles off to the proper length for the rain cap. Above the entire group of tools is a 6-foot step ladder. The ladder has multiple uses, but its main use is to get you up to the top of the teepee when you start to put in the lacing pins as you pin them down the front. It's also used if you're setting a teepee up by yourself. You can set the entire teepee up using this ladder. We'll show you how to do this as we go through the setup procedure. This concludes the tools and materials that you will need to set up your teepee. The teepee poles are both the foundation for the teepee and the architecture for the teepee. If you have received your teepee poles from us, they have already been hand peeled for you. All you need to do is look at each pole carefully and smooth out any bumps or rough spots. In order to ensure that your teepee poles will last as long as possible, we recommend that you put a good quality wood preservative on the poles. If you want something that is very organic, we suggest a solution of 50% boiled linseed oil and 50% turpentine. You can buy a gallon of each and mix them together. There are also many very good commercial products that would treat the poles adequately. Be sure that your poles are dry before you put on the solution. Put on a coat, give it 2 or 3 days to dry, and then put on another coat. We recommend at least 2 coats, and I think 3 is ideal. Properly prepared poles will last 15 or 20 years. The poles in our 18-foot teepee are lodgepole pine. This is the tree that the Native Americans preferred for their lodges and is the origin of the name lodgepole pine. If you are getting your teepee poles yourself, then there are a few guidelines that you will need to follow. Any species of tree is acceptable that is reasonably straight. Standing dead trees are fine for teepee poles as long as they're not rotten. And bamboo is also an acceptable teepee pole. The length of your teepee poles will be 2 feet longer than the stated size of your teepee. For instance, an 18-foot teepee will have a 20-foot minimum pole. We suggest at least 4 feet longer than the stated size of the teepee, and you can have a pole as long as you like. The size of the pole at the butt is important. They should average about 3 to 3.5 inches in diameter. If you have a really large teepee, a 22-foot teepee or even larger, you may want to go up to a 3.5 but maximum 4-inch diameter at the butt of the pole. The other critical pole measurement that you want to pay attention to is the diameter of the pole where the poles cross or touch each other. That should be 1.5 inches to 2 inches and no more. You will need 17 poles for your teepee. 15 poles will be used inside for the teepee structure, and 2 poles will be used outside for the smoke flap poles. On smaller teepees, like a 14-foot teepee, you can drop 3 poles on the inside. Or, with larger teepees, like a 22-foot teepee, you can add 3 poles to the inside structure. Whether you cut your poles green or are using dry poles, you will need to peel the bark off. The ideal tool is a draw knife. Or, if you like, an electric planer works also. Peel the pole smooth. Take your time and remove all the knots. It is important to dry your poles properly. Lay them flat and rotate them each day in order to keep the pole straight as it dries. If you don't have room to lay them flat, it's perfectly acceptable to stand them up in a tree or against a building, but again, rotate them each day to be sure they remain straight. This concludes preparing your teepee poles. Now we will begin the very important step of laying out the teepee tripod. First, look at your entire group of poles and separate out your 4 sturdiest poles and also your 2 smallest poles. 3 of the 4 sturdiest poles will be used as your tripod poles. The remaining 4th pole will be used as your teepee lift pole. The 2 smallest poles will be used as your 2 smoke flap poles. Our next step is to prepare the smoke flap poles. The smoke flap poles need to be 2 feet longer than the stated size of the teepee. For the 18-foot teepee that we will be putting up today, the smoke flap poles need to be 20 feet long. Measure them and cut them at this distance. The smoke flap poles are the smallest of the poles because they need to flex around the teepee to create tension on the smoke flap pockets. This helps keep the smoke flaps themselves taut and sturdy for their intended use to help guide the smoke out of the teepee. Be sure and smooth and round the end of the smoke flap poles themselves because they will sit in the smoke flap pockets. We don't want them to slowly abrase or tear the smoke flap pocket itself. Now you need to imagine exactly where you want to put your teepee. The door should always face east. It's helpful to run a line and stakes around the perimeter so you know your location as you set up your tripod. The green ring shows you exactly where we plan to set up the teepee. Now look at the ground plan and you will notice the 3 tripod poles, the door pole, the south pole, and the north pole. Look at their positions on the ground plan diagram. We will now lay in the 3 tripod poles. Now we will pick up the poles and walk them over to the site. It is easy to carry a pole vertically. We will now place the south pole and the north pole on the ground plan as you've seen in the diagram. The south pole and north pole lay side by side. The door pole will be placed, as you see on the ground plan diagram, right beside the left-hand point of the door hole. This is an approximation at this point, but do your best to locate that point. The door pole crosses the north and south pole. Now, look at the diagram for your distances in your layout and also in the Nomadics Tipi setup book. We will now find the exact distances for the south pole, north pole, and door pole and tie them together as a tripod. Measure the distance of the south pole and north pole according to the measurement diagram. This distance is the point where the door pole will cross the north pole and the south pole. Mark your poles so you'll know these positions as you continue tying your tripod poles together. Measure your door pole to the correct length also. See the measurement diagram for these distances. Now cross the door pole across the two north and south poles so that the three marks line up exactly. This is very important, and now you've established the exact length for these three poles, and the tripod will fit your teepee perfectly. Now take your 45-foot long teepee tie rope and measure 8 feet off one end. Place a mark there after you've made your measurement. This is the amount of rope that we will need to tie the tripod. Notice that it's sitting on a ladder. You can use it on the ladder or you can bring it up on your knee. But be certain that you relocate the 3 marks that show the proper length for the north pole, south pole, and your door pole. Now, we will tie a clove hitch around the bundle. This is the strongest knot that we have for this bundle. It is excellent. Look at the tying diagram also. This knot is self-tightening. Pull it tight and keep it that way as you continue to tie your tripod. Notice that the top rope goes over the 2 underneath. This causes it to be self-tightening. Wrap the remaining amount of the rope around the 3 tripod poles, pulling it tight as you go around the poles. Finish off by tying the remaining part of the rope to the top of the door pole. You will finish by putting another clove hitch at this point. Again, look at the diagram to understand how to tie this knot. Pull it snug also. Here you see the rope going across the top of the other 2, which tightens and holds this particular knot very securely. Now I will demonstrate for you how to raise your tripod by yourself. One person can do this. Put stakes at the end of your door pole, your north pole, and south pole. This will keep the poles from moving as you raise the tripod. An 8-foot ladder is an excellent bridge to help you raise the tripod. Simply lift the tripod up and place it on the ladder. This gives you enough initial leverage off the ground to continue to pull the tripod up with the remaining 45-foot long tripod tie rope. You'll notice that you cannot pull the tripod up by yourself from a short distance. you need the length of the long stake that you've driven in the ground. Pull the tripod up slowly, get it almost vertical, and then tie it off to the stake. Now go over to your north and south poles, and the pole on your left, as I'm standing looking at the poles, is the north pole. You will simply gently pull this pole up off the ground and swing it to the north position in the tripod. This pole is the sturdy pole of the whole entire setup, and it is that easy to put a tripod up by yourself. Now, you see the ring, and you see how the poles fit around the ring. This is the ground plan diagram. If you have someone to help you, of course, it's easier. Simply walk up underneath the poles and have the other person slowly pull on the rope until the poles get nearly vertical. Of course, be careful not to pull them over on yourself. And once again, simply take the north pole and swing it out, adjusting it to the approximate place on the ring that you've made for your ground plan. Notice that the tripod is very strong and easily supports our weight. Now, look at the ground plan graphic and the measurements. You can also find this in the Tipi Setup book. Now it's important to determine exactly where your door pole will go. It will go just to the left of your door hole. So imagine exactly where you want your teepee and move this door pole so it sits right beside the left-hand side of your door hole. Now, referring to the Tipi Setup book and your ground plan diagram, get the exact measurements between the door pole and the south pole and the door pole and the north pole. And between the south and north pole, look at the diagram. It is essential that these measurements be correct. If you have your ground plan diagram measurements correct, your teepee will set up perfectly. Once you have determined the exact position for your door pole, north pole, and south pole, drive a stake in at the butt of the pole to be certain that they don't move as you continue with your setup. Now you're ready to lay in the remaining teepee poles into the tripod. Notice the front crotch of poles, the large V. This is where all of the poles will go that are on this side of the teepee. Measure about 36 inches from the door pole and place your hammer there. This is where the number 1 pole will go. It goes to the right-hand side of your door hole opening. Drop the poles into the crotch very slowly. Continue around according to the ground plan with pole number 2, pole number 3, and pole number 4. Notice that the poles lay one on top of another. This is pole 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pole number 5 will start to the left of the door pole. It goes in the front crotch also. Pole number 6 will go on top of pole number 5. Place them in gently so you don't disturb the bundle of poles. Pole number 8 will follow pole number 7, and there is still just a slight front crotch that you can slip pole number 8 in. Lay it in gently so you don't roll the poles out. Now, to secure these last remaining poles, take a line and tie it to your south pole, and then go to number 6 pole. Tie it across gently but firmly, and then go to pole 7 and pole 8. This will secure these poles while you're putting up the other poles and before you get the teepee rope wrapped around the entire bundle to secure it. Notice how your poles should look. Now we're ready to put the poles around the back of the teepee. Go around to the back of the teepee and look up. You will see another crotch. This is the back crotch, and this is where poles 9, 10, 11, and your lift pole will go. Look at your ground plan. We will start with pole number 9. Drop it into this back crotch. Pole number 10 will be next. Place it gently in the back crotch also. Notice that it is not in the back center of the teepee. This is where the lift pole goes. This will be our last pole, and this is the pole that we lift up the teepee cover with. Now, take the remaining 45 foot of line and slowly walk around your teepee. You will snap the line and move it up so that it binds all the poles together. You want to watch the line up top there to be sure that the rope binds against itself as you go around. Go around at least 3 times or 4 times if you have the rope. Once you go around each time, pull gently on the poles to secure the rope, but don't pull hard enough that you move the poles. Snap the rope as you walk around, and it will bind the wrap tightly. Again, lean back on the rope to keep a tight bind at the top, but don't pull the teepee poles off the ground. Once you have gone around the teepee 4 times, slowly walk into the teepee, keeping the rope taut, then simply wrap it around and around the North Pole, and this secures your tie rope. Now we're ready to tie the teepee to the teepee lift pole and put the teepee around the poles. Open your teepee out into a big butterfly. It is a good idea to treat your teepee each year with a mold and mildew retardant. This is a good time to paint or spray the mold and mildew formula onto your teepee canvas. Slide the lift pole up underneath the teepee. Notice that the outside of the teepee is facing up. Place 2 stakes in the peg loops that are on either side of your lift pole. This will secure the fabric so that you can stretch it properly when attaching it to the lift pole. We suggest leaving all of your teepee poles 4 inches beneath your fabric. This way, when the fabric is pulled tightly, you still have a 2 or 3 inch air gap at the bottom of the teepee. Have someone hold the teepee at the bottom very firmly against the pole when you put the nail into the top of the lift pole. Stretch the teepee firmly. Nail the tack in at the base of your lift pole flap loop. Place a 4-foot piece of rope through the loop to secure the flap to the pole. The tack keeps the teepee from slipping while you put it up. Wrap the rope around the lift pole flap with overhand knots and finish with a square knot. Make a mark with your pin at the top of the lift pole flap. This way you can be certain that it hasn't moved after you put the teepee up. Place a small stick in each of your smoke flap pockets. This will make it very easy for you to put your smoke flap pole into your smoke flap pocket. The small stick will fall out when the pole goes in. When you had cut the 1/8 inch braided nylon cord to make your peg loop tie lines, you had about 30 feet of cord left over. Now cut this 30 feet of cord into 2 15-foot pieces and tie each piece onto the end of your smoke flap at the smoke flap peg loop. Now before you put your teepee around, you will need to take each of your dowels and sharpen them. Your lacing pins need to have a good sharp point on them in order to go through the buttonhole on your lacing pins. You will also, at this point, need to take one of your pins and open and stretch each of the buttonholes so that it's much easier to get the lacing pin in through the buttonholes as you're putting the lacing pins together on the front of the teepee. Now, in order to put the teepee cover around the teepee, we first need to attach the teepee to the lift pole. We do this by bringing the 2 sides in a half at a time, and then slowly we will wrap the teepee around the teepee lift pole. Now, in order to make it easier to lift the teepee up on the lift pole, we will take the lines from the smoke flaps and wrap them gently around the teepee. This will hold the teepee to the pole as we lift it up and make it much easier to manage. If you're working with larger teepees, this can be done by running longer lines around the teepee. Here, we're going to be putting up a 22-foot teepee. We bring it around in the same manner and get the teepee closely piled to the lift pole. Now that the cover is neatly piled beside the lift pole, take some long lines of string or rope and tie them loosely around the cover. The reason you want a long line is so you can pull it off once the teepee cover is standing up. Wrap the line loosely around the teepee and do not tie a knot. In this way, it will hold the teepee cover against the pole well, but when you need it to unfurl, it will come down easily. The lift pole goes at the very back center of your teepee poles. Place the butt of the lift pole in the position and the tripod ground plan that you wish it to be sitting when you're finished. Then slowly raise the teepee up on the lift pole. You can secure the butt of the lift pole if it seems to be sliding. This pole now will go directly in to the back crotch. Turn the pole so that the teepee is facing outward. Drop the poles slowly into the middle back crotch. Now, before we bring the teepee cover around, we want to move each teepee pole in towards the middle about 6 inches or so. However, do not move the door pole, the north pole, or the south pole. Those 3 poles stay permanently where they are. This will make it much easier to get the cover around, so it won't have tension on it when we're trying to lace it up in the front and get it smoothed out and centered on the poles. Unwrap your ties, and now make sure that your smoke flaps are not bound up underneath the teepee fabric. You want them to fly free as you slowly open the teepee out. On the right, you see the smoke flap now is caught underneath the fabric. We'll stop and get that free of the fabric. If it gets caught up and you can't get it out, it's very easy to use a smoke flap pole to pull it out from underneath the cover. When you bring the cover around the poles, it's very helpful to billow it, to get air under it and let it float around rather than dragging it around on the poles. Bring the pinning facing to the middle of your door hole. Now I'm adjusting the lift pole to bring the teepee down to the exact position that it needs to be to properly reach around the upper part of the poles. The lift pole is directly in the center back of the teepee. Notice now that the cover is loose and there's a uniformity to the way it hangs around the poles. At this point, you can flop the cover and loosen the cover and billow the cover until the major wrinkles come out. Now I am pointing out the south pole, here the lift pole, and here the north pole. These poles are in fixed positions, and you notice there's approximately 4 inches of pole showing below the teepee itself. The rest of the teepee is very loose. Don't worry about where it is. That will be adjusted later. At this point, if you haven't sharpened a point on all your lacing pins, you will need to do so. Now, take the 8-foot ladder and put it up inside the teepee. The first thing we will do is to bring the teepee around and tie the 2 ties that are provided at the very top of the pinning facing. There's one you see now. We will tie these 2 together to hold the teepee secure so we can start putting in the lacing pins. Again, at this point, the cover is still very loose around the poles. The teepee is designed for the left side of the pinning facing to go on top of the right side, left over right. These are what the lacing pins look like when they're put through the pinning facing. Now we will start at the top, and you put a lacing pin in to the left-hand pinning facing on the right-hand buttonhole. Then you will pick up the buttonhole beneath it, as you see here. This gives you leverage. When you turn it, this is the inside view of the teepee. Slip it through and go back out the front. Twisting motion or a screwing motion really helps the pin slide through the buttonholes. The buttonholes will be tight because they're intended to be waterproof. This is the view from the inside of the teepee. Continue on down the pinning facing from the top down. Notice the leverage that I can get by this method. Notice that the left side of the pinning facing goes on top of the right side. Secure the pinning facing underneath the door also. And now that we have pinned the teepee together, the next thing we're going to do is to stake it down. You will need your hammer, a knife to cut cord with, and the tent stakes. The cord should be cut into 30-inch pieces for each peg loop. Measure the pieces and cut them at 30 inches. We suggest burning the ties on the ends of the nylon so they won't ravel. This is very strong braided nylon cord. Slip the cord through the peg loop, as you see here. You notice that the teepee is not completely flat. These small wrinkles are fine, but do notice there's a uniformity to them going all the way around. If the teepee cover at this point is this high on your door pole, it means that your door pole has slipped in your tripod. You will need to take it down and retie your tripod. Now we are going to demonstrate for you the proper way to stake down the teepee. Get someone to help you pull the teepee down and out. Pull the teepee down and out. Choose the correct position for your stake, and then pull the teepee out again as hard as you can and tie it to the stake. A quick overhand knot on the outside of the stake will secure it immediately. Put another overhand knot behind your stake and finish off with a square knot in the front of the stake. Then drive the stake completely down and into the ground. Start staking your teepee down from the front of the teepee. Notice how we pull the teepee down and out, and I select the point where the stake would be the most effective. The first 2 stakes go in directly beneath the door hole. Then put in 2 more on either side in the front, and then move to the back of the teepee. Do the 4 peg loops there, and then move to the sides. If you're setting your teepee up on a deck, you can use eye bolts to screw into the deck itself and attach the line from the peg loop to the eye bolt. This is very secure. Here you see there are still some wrinkles in the back of the teepee. You will notice that as we stake it down and pull the fabric down and out, the wrinkles will disappear. Now you go inside the teepee and push each pole one at a time out. The door pole and the number 1 pole go right beside the door hole itself. This gives a great, sharp, firm edge to the door hole. And again, you want 3 to 4 inches sticking out with a pole beneath the teepee cover. This allows airflow to come up underneath the teepee cover and help eliminate smoke from the fire. So now we will continue to push the poles out against the cover. Twist the poles to loosen them in the tie rope and push them out as firmly as you can against the cover. The door pole and the north pole and the south pole and the lift pole cannot be moved. They should remain where they are. Now you see a uniform space around the bottom of the teepee, and the canvas itself is completely taut and wrinkle-free. When the poles are pushed out against the cover, you've finished setting up your teepee. Notice that with the cover pulled down and out, you have a little rain lip at the edge of the cover, which keeps rain and moisture and melting snow from dripping onto the poles. You can also place a stone underneath each of your poles in order to keep them from becoming slowly rotten or damp against the ground. You see the door pole and the number 1 pole going right by the door hole itself. The teepee is now taut and tight like a drum. Now we will put the smoke flap poles into the smoke flap pockets. If you have not already prepared your smoke flap poles, do so now. Measure the pole so that it is 2 feet longer than the stated size of the teepee. For our 18-foot teepee here, I'm measuring 20 feet. Cut the pole at this point and smooth it off with a rasp so that the rounded end will not tear or abrase the smoke pocket fabric. Place the smoke flap poles into the smoke flap pockets and move the pole to the rear of the teepee. Cross the poles in this manner and put a slight bit of tension on the pole. You notice that the poles flex and bend, bow around the teepee. This is desirable and creates a constant tension on the pole and keeps the smoke flap firm and stiff. If your teepee is only up for a short period of time, you may want to take your smoke flap lines and tie them to a stake around the front of the teepee. This secures them against wind or weather for short periods of time. For longer periods of time, or if your teepee is set up on a permanent basis, you will need to put a pole in front of the teepee. We attach the smoke flap lines to this pole in order to maneuver the smoke flap pockets properly and to give them a good, rigid, sail-like edge. By pulling on the lines, the smoke flaps will become taut and create a vacuum for the smoke from the fire to rise upward. If you're only in your teepee for a few months or maybe the summer, a tent stake of anything will do. In this case, a fence post would be fine. For longer periods of time, a permanent wooden stake in front of the teepee is a great idea. Or you can tie them to a tree if it's available. The smoke flaps are very important. They must remain rigid and are used like the sail on a ship to trim according to the wind direction, again to create a vacuum so that the smoke from the fire will be pulled upward and out of the teepee. Now your teepee is completely set up. Smoke poles in place, smoke lines attached to the front, and the teepee beautifully staked down with no wrinkles. Your smoke flaps are essential for eliminating smoke from the teepee. When the wind blows across the upper edges, it creates a partial vacuum between the two smoke flaps, pulling the smoke up and out of the teepee. The smoke flap poles are used to maneuver these so that you can put your flaps where they need to be. You see here the smoke flap poles should only be about 2 feet from the back edge of the teepee. If they're longer than that, you need to cut them down some. Notice the smoke flap itself is trimmed very tightly. You must know what direction the wind is blowing from. It is essential because the smoke flaps will always be angled downwind in order to maximize the vacuum between the two flaps. The teepee door hole should always face downwind. If you're in a valley or an unusual canyon where your winds are not from the west predominantly, then be certain to set your teepee up so that the door hole faces downwind with regard to the most common wind direction that you have. Although you may not necessarily think so, there is always a breeze, even though it may be very, very faint. Now I'm going to go around the back of the teepee and set the smoke flaps in the normal position for a west wind. Again, the door hole should be facing east, which means the predominant winds will be from the back of the teepee. So we put the smoke flap poles tight together. We get them snug in the pockets. We move the smoke flaps themselves a little bit closer together than they were before, and we tighten them up. This is the standard position that your smoke flaps will be in about 90% of the time. If you don't have a fire in the teepee or you're not using a fire, then the smoke flaps will simply stay like this all of the time. Now we will demonstrate for you how to set the smoke flaps if the wind is from the south. In this case, from left to right. Notice that the smoke flap pole is used to keep tension on the pocket and to keep the line of the smoke flap rigid. Here, I'm moving the flap on the right, or the north flap, out and downwind. Now notice that the smoke flaps are angled to the right, and the smoke flap on the left is covering over the smoke hole, so that rain or snow, if it were storming from the left or from the south, could not come in the smoke hole itself. But because the smoke flaps are angled and leaning far to the right, the wind coming across from left to right would create a strong vacuum between the two flaps and pull the smoke up and out of the teepee. Now we will demonstrate for you how to set your smoke flaps and smoke flap poles for a north wind or a storm from the north. Always set the poles so that there's still a rigid line on the pole and good tension in your smoke flap pocket. Notice how far around the side of the teepee I'm bringing the north smoke pole so that the smoke flap covers the smoke hole entirely. Again, keeping rain or snow from coming in the top of the teepee. When you move your smoke flap poles, you will also need to go around the front of the teepee and tighten up the smoke flap lines. Here, you see what a nice rigid line you can create with your smoke flaps by keeping your smoke flap lines taut in the front of the teepee. Once again, see how the north flap covers the smoke hole. No rain or snow can come in, but the smoke can go out. Keep your smoke flaps trimmed tightly in this direction. Now I will demonstrate for you what we would do if there were an extremely strong storm from the north or from right to left. Take your smoke flap lines and tie them tightly down and around the side of the teepee. Tie them to one of the stakes. This way your flaps are held tightly against the teepee and winds can't rip and pull at the flap. Notice how downwind these flaps have been angled. I'll also go around behind the teepee and move the south flap even further open. This makes certain that the smoke can get out of the teepee and have an escape route. Here you see how the flaps shingle over one another. no rain or snow can blow in, and still the smoke is pulled up and out and disappears from the teepee. Now we will show you how to use your smoke flaps in the unusual case that wind comes directly from the east or blows directly into the smoke hole itself. First, both flaps are taken around back and opened out. What we're going to do is to maneuver the wind so that as it hits the teepee, we want to direct it upwards instead of into the smoke hole. Take the lines and tie them tightly on opposite sides of the front of the teepee. By tightening down the lower part of the flaps, we create a surface that will guide the wind up and across the smoke flaps, which creates the vacuum to draw the smoke out of the teepee. Notice how the wind then is moved upward and guided upward along the smoke flap lines. So finally, we will show you how you want to secure and close your teepee if you're leaving for a period of time. Most of the storm winds where we live in the Central Oregon high desert come from the southwest. So I'm going to close the south flap, or the one on the left, on top of the right flap. I'll get the pole that goes to the north flap, and I'll move that pole around now to the right-hand side of the teepee, slowly working it up and carefully working it up against the poles and against the tie rope so that it is a snug fit, like pulling a sweater around your neck. Then we will take the south pole and we will bring it across the north pole and create a very snug fit around the top of the teepee. Do this carefully and gently, maintaining as snug a fit as you can around the teepee poles. Work the poles gently to make them as snug as possible. Then pull the smoke flap lines down and around the teepee and tighten them up to a tent peg. Notice, again, how the smoke flaps are shingled over one another to keep the weather out. The teepee door cover is designed to keep rain and snow and high winds out of the teepee. The ties all around the door have specific points with which they're tied to secure the door. Here, we'll start from the inside of the teepee, and we will take the tie at the very top of our door cover and slip it underneath the second lacing pin above the door. Pull the lacing pin back just a little bit to give yourself a chance to get the tie underneath the lacing pin. Then reach outside and slide the lacing pin back into its place. Pull the tie through the pin and snug it up to the top of the pin. This way, the top of the door is secured inside the teepee and begins to form a shingling effect for rain and snow to run off the teepee cover onto the door and onto the ground. Tie it securely to the teepee poles on either side, in this case to the number 1 pole to the left of the door hole. And on the right-hand side to the door pole itself. Now, tie the second tie down to the door pole also. These will remain tied the entire time that your teepee is up. What I'm doing here is providing for a right-hand opening door. You can tie it to the left if you want a left-hand opening door. Now this is the appearance from the inside of the teepee. You notice at the bottom of the door hole, the teepee door cover goes over the teepee, shingling it. On the outside, there is a tie and a peg loop on both sides of the door. Since I am designing this as a right-hand opening door, I will tie the tie on the left-hand side securely to the teepee. This is to make certain that any strong winds will not move the door off the teepee. The ties on the lower left-hand corner of the door are tied together now in a square knot, and then we'll take a line and tie from that to a peg loop. This secures the lower left-hand corner of the door against wind or rain. In Central Oregon, most of our weather comes from the south. That's another reason that I'm having a right-hand opening door. The left-hand side of the door cover is tied down tightly. You will need a stick or a pole or something for a door handle. Here, I've cut some holes using a drill into a pole, and I'm tying the lines through that hole. This is a secure way to keep the door cover attached to your door handle. Notice that the teepee door goes up underneath the teepee cover. In this way, rain and melting snow are shingled off of the teepee onto the door and go all the way to the ground. You can also use a staple as a way to attach the door ties to your door handle. Smooth out the fabric where the teepee door hole and your door cover meet. This accordion-style design allows the rain and snow to flow down and away from your teepee door hole. If you're going in and out of the teepee a lot, or it's summer, You may want to simply loosen the top tie, keep the lower two attached, and use your door handle in this fashion. If you're leaving, tie the bottom tie around the second lacing pin. This will secure the door while you're away. Anything will do, and you can be creative here. Sticks, branches, or poles make a beautiful door handle. If you're setting your teepee up only for the summer, you may want to remove the bottom 3 lacing pins beneath the door. It makes it more convenient if there's a lot of traffic, children, or small pets. This concludes our Nomadics Tipi Makers teepee setup demonstration.